We're going to talk about a topic that I think is one of the most interesting and most important ones that all of us deal with in the various roles that we have in our organizations, and that is working closely with volunteers. Volunteers are, by and large, the lifeblood of our organizations, and they become very much part of the work that we do. And I would say in the years that I've been working with them, probably the most rewarding parts of my career have been in working with very committed, strong, wonderful volunteers, and they have always inspired me along the way. Also, however, it is one of the most challenging aspects of our work, and one in which we can easily be tripped up. So what I'd like to do now is give you a little sense of what we hope to cover in the next, say, 40 or so minutes, and then allow some time for questions. And we're going to cover a lot of material. Those of you who are sitting in rooms where you're looking down at some big screen, don't worry, you're going to get copies of all of this material, and you'll get an audio of this within the next few days will be sent to you. So you can just try to listen and follow along. I'd like to talk first about volunteer mandates in terms of reference and the importance of having these written documents as we work with volunteers. We'll discuss the role that we play in recruiting volunteers, our work in supporting boards and committees, and this topic, which perhaps is the most important of all, which is developing a real strong chemistry, frankly a magical chemistry that we need to have with our volunteers and that our volunteers have with our organizations. I'll then run through a few, rather quickly, some tips for staffing volunteers that will pick up on some of the things that we've talked about earlier. I'll try to lay out for you some challenges that I think we have in volunteer management. And yes, here's the teaser, folks, that I know everyone's tuning in for this. How do we deal with that issue of firing a volunteer? So we will get to that, and then finally sum up with some key success factors. So there's a lot of material here, so let's go. The first topic is this issue of volunteer mandates or terms of reference. And when I say volunteer mandates, what we're really referring to is having very specific descriptions and a sense of purpose as to why we need volunteers and what we want them to do. So overall, in terms of the work that we do with volunteers, we need to approach this in a very professional and strategic manner. We need to recognize that volunteers are every bit as important in our organizations as our own paid staff. And it is important for us to think about volunteers in this way and be as deliberate in our strategies with them as we are about staff. It is also, I think, quite critical that we set a standard of professional performance and decorum that really sets a standard for volunteer performance as well. I've been a long believer in that you get back what you give, and if you approach volunteers in that very serious way, they come back and take on their assignments in a very serious manner as well. And remember that they are volunteers. They are not paid. They are doing this for a whole range of reasons, of course, but they are indeed volunteers, and we must not forget that and indeed respect it, because all of us in this, I'll say we're all in a virtual room here, we're all the paid staff. So let's start with this concept of thinking about how we deal with, when we're thinking about our staff and job searches in our own organizations. Our human resources departments always have mandates and job descriptions for those posts. We need, it seems to us, to apply the very same principle as it relates to volunteers. We need to think very strategically about the way in which volunteers are going to play a role in our organization and the kinds of things that we want them to do to help to advance our organization. And so we would suggest that an important way to start is to have some written documents related to volunteers, some job descriptions, and I'm going to go through some examples of job descriptions in a moment, have a sense of manuals that help to orient the volunteer to what your organization does and to the kinds of behavior and performance and tasks that you want the volunteer to do. And I think also having, in a sense, letters of engagement in the same way we do when we hire an employee that make it very clear, again, just how seriously we are taking the business of working with volunteers. In the area of job descriptions, we would suggest that you have job descriptions for your boards and your committees, job descriptions for your individual volunteers that sit on those boards or committees, and of course job descriptions for the officers of those boards and committees. By having written job descriptions, it really underscores the purpose of that volunteer, the role that he or she plays, the protocols and behaviors that are part of your organization and part of the way you work with volunteers. A job description clearly lays out the expectations that you have of the person or of the committee, and it should give a sense of a time frame for the task and how long this task is going to be valid in terms of your request to the person, and as well a sense of the staff support, the kind of support that the volunteer might expect or the committee might expect from you or your organization. In looking at some of the components of a written job description, I think really these job descriptions are very similar to the kinds of job descriptions that you use for your own staff. You want to have an opening summary statement. You want to be able to list very specifically the responsibilities and expectations. If it's a committee, it's important to have in writing, what is the composition of the committee? Some committees have certain representatives or delegates, certain kinds of qualities. Important to have that written out. How long is the service for this volunteer? Sometimes it's a term of 2 or 3 years, whatever that is. How often are you expecting the volunteer to meet and to be related to the organization? So if there are specific meetings, and certainly with committees and boards there are, what are the expectations? Very clearly. Some organizations do actually have a situation in which they say, more than one absence from a board meeting and you're in a sense kicked off. You need to think those through, be deliberate in terms of thinking about them. Try to give a sense of the hours of service. So again, as you see where we're headed here, it's the same way as when you and I are thinking about a job and we look at that job description and we find out, how many hours they expect us to work, is it over the weekends, what are the, et cetera. The same sort of orientation that way. The reporting structure, of course, to whom does the volunteer report, or to what body does the committee report? A task force sometimes reports to various committees or other commissions that ultimately report to the board. And then, of course, the staff support. So let me show you here quickly an example of a job description. And this is an actual job description, and when you all receive this in writing, you'll be able to read it in much more detail. But I wanted to just give you a little sense of how the components look. So this particular one is a job description for a development committee, and I know many of you I'm talking to are focused quite specifically on development, but not all of you. So you have your summary statement, what it is that the development committee actually is meant to do, so the purpose. Then we get to the very specific delineation of responsibilities, in this case to identify major individual corporate foundation donors, et cetera, listing them all out. When you get this material, as I say, in a couple of days, you'll be able to look at those. But the point is to be very specific about what it is you're seeking that committee that committee to do. Here's the membership one. Who's on? Who are the members? How are they constituted? The chair shall be an advisory board member, meaning the chair would be part of the overall board or whatever. It makes it clear to the committee how it's structured. The terms of office. This case says 3 years. Meetings held at a minimum on a quarterly basis. Reporting, as we talked about earlier, and then staff support. The development office shall provide direct support to the committee. Just giving you, again, an example of the components. Here's a job description for a post. This is a campaign co-chair. Again, we have that opening sort of summary statement of what this is all about. We then go very specifically into the responsibilities. We talk about the terms. And in this case, this particular campaign is going to last over a 5-year period. We all know about the quiet phase of campaigns, et cetera. Very interesting part here, the time commitment. That in this case, the co-chair is expected can anticipate 1 to 2 meetings per month. Formal meetings of the Campaign Volunteer Committee held on a quarterly basis, but regular monthly meetings with the management of the ABC Institute and the development staff, and making clear that at times most convenient for the co-chairs, and about how many appointments might he or she expect, 5 to 7. So you see, you have this very clearly written out, very well thought out, and you are then in a particularly good position to move to the recruitment piece, which we're going to talk about in the next section here. So just to summarize, terms of reference are critical tools in volunteer management, and having these written documents are very important. And you'll see how important they become when we get to that teaser about the firing issue. Roadmap for service, it provides a clear sense of how you want the committee to work with the organization and gives you guideposts as you manage them. It provides an important tool for maintaining the focus of the committee and the volunteers, essential when misunderstandings occur, and again underscores the seriousness with which you're taking the volunteer function in the organization. Now I'm going to move to volunteer recruitment, and this is looking at the process that we might take on when we're looking at how we go about trying to recruit people to take these positions. Again, I would stress to you the importance throughout all of what we're talking of being strategic and professional, and being very thorough in the planning process for thinking about individuals that one is recruiting as volunteers. I think the analogy remains with human resources planning. Thinking again, when we're looking at staff, we have been very strategic. We've thought about the issues. We've thought about why we want to allocate resources to that staff position, et cetera. And there really are 2 levels of planning that one needs to think about as one's trying to consider the best way in which one can recruit a volunteer. First is the organizational level, having that clearly defined mission, and certainly having written out these things makes it so much easier when you get to the recruitment process. Thinking very strategically about the qualities that one wants to have in this volunteer position or on a committee. In the same way one has specifications for hiring staff where we say a certain level of expertise and experience, one needs to think this way about what do we need in our organizations or in this post or in this committee. And I'm going to show you in a minute what I call a strategic grid, which will show you how this can help you to kind of picture this. And then staffing and support that's required, that you have thought through how much staffing is it going to take to support this person or this committee, and do we have that, and are we able to deal with that, with the amount of staffing? And I would tell you, if you determine you need a certain level of staffing and you can't do it, I wouldn't go ahead and recruit that person, because you will end up being in much further difficult situation. So this is an important thing to have thought about in advance. Then on the personal level, or we might substitute the word candidate level, as we're thinking of candidates for these volunteer positions, we should have done thorough research on them. We should have a CV or a summary of his or her experience, and experience in volunteering, not just the experience that the person may have professionally. And we should have some references. So again, you see the analogy up here to the human resources planning. We always have, when we're looking at candidates, we have the CV, we know about the references, we've researched who these people are before we actually bring them in and interview them, and certainly before we hire them. Now, here's the grid, and this is a grid that I've used in many different settings, and this particular one is really more focused on a university, but you can decide what categories you want. But when you're thinking about a committee and you're trying to come up with the composition of a committee, or let's say you're dealing with a committee that's already in place, or a board that has terms that turn over, and you have a nominating process, et cetera, it's important to think about what are the desired qualities, attributes, and skills you want present on that committee. What's the complexion of different perspectives and views that you need in order to be able to enrich the deliberations that are going to focus you on the tasks that you need for that board or committee to do to service your organization. And so one way of doing this is you can take current committee or board members and you can sort of graph them this way. I mean, you can determine what your categories are. In this particular instance, one was looking at professions and geography, and this is class, again, related to a university degree, gender. Okay, get a sense, and you begin to put these X's in here, et cetera, so you have a sense of that. Then when you start looking at your candidates, you can also categorize them. And you can begin then, when you see where you have gaps up here that you feel are really important, you start to begin to see how do you prioritize this candidate list, and who are the individuals that might be most appropriate as the first people on the list to be asking to sit on this committee or to be a chair or whatever it is. So it's a tool that you can use to your own to fit your own organization. You have to decide what are the things on these axes. But it is something that I think is very helpful, and it's extremely helpful if you're doing this, if you're in a situation where you're staffing the nominating process for a board, and you have that. So working with volunteers who are charged with the nominating process for a board, this can be very helpful, very important staff work for them to see and to be able to think through some of the critical issues. So when we get to the actual issue now of the process of recruiting that candidate that we want, that priority person that we think is the best one, I'd like to draw the analogy in this case to those of you who are involved in major donor solicitations. It's exactly the same. It's that highly personalized approach to the individual. Once you've decided who is the priority person that you want, in the same way we personalize so carefully our work in developing our relationships with major donors, think of it in the same way. You have to have a clearly articulated reason for why you are going to Mary or Scott and saying, we want you, this is the reason we believe you are the right person for this particular post. That's very similar to the case for support that one presents to a major donor as to why we believe that individual donor can make such a difference in our organizations. It's important to have professional supporting documents. We refer to these as collaterals when we're in the major gift process, as all of you know out there. But the job descriptions we've already talked about, when you have that in writing, boy, does it really underscore to this candidate, boy, they have really thought through, this is very serious what they're looking at. The mission and goals of the organization, and why this particular post is so critical to advancing that, and some appropriate information about your organization. What do you do? What are you about? What are the how do you go about trying to implement your mission and your goals? Then we go to the appropriate recruiters. Sound familiar, folks? Who are the appropriate people to make the solicitation? Exactly the same sort of analogy here. Appropriate venue and means. Again, this is going to sound very, very familiar to those of you involved in solicitation. Sometimes it's go to her office and sit down with her in the office. Sometimes it's have lunch with her. Sometimes it's I'll see her for coffee. It's very, think about this. Again, remember that highly personalized approach. And finally, a time frame for the decision that the person will tell you yes or no. In the same way we do that when we're doing a major or any kind of a situation, we give a time frame for a decision and a chance to reflect. Certainly, you don't expect someone to say yes right off the bat. Now let's get to the issue of, okay, we've recruited the people that we want, et cetera. What is our role in staffing a board and a committee? And how do we go about making sure we have the proper professional support for them? Once again, I would suggest to you that you maintain that very professional interaction at all times. It is very important that you are able to plan carefully the agendas that you are suggesting for committees and for boards, and that they're on time. And I would say that if you have a meeting and it's scheduled from 1 to 2, be sure it's over at 2. If you have individual meetings, when you go in to see Mary and you tell her, and we've all had this experience, I'd like to, may I come and see you for 30 minutes? I'd like your advice on something. And you're finished in 22 minutes. How often, we've all had this, how often when Mary will turn to you and say, when you called me, Royal, I figured it was going to be an hour. I didn't, you know what? You can come and have a meeting with me anytime you want when you are so accurate about the timing about this meeting. That's just, again, it demonstrates the professionalism that you have in dealing with these volunteers. It is important to make sure that the committee or the board and the individuals on those committees and boards are engaged in meaningful project work and in task assignments that are involved with the mission of the organization, and that you have the responsibility of showing them what they're doing, sometimes at a very detailed level, is so important to advancing the mission. It is important as we're working with volunteers, for them to gain a real sense of ownership for their work. And if we clearly outline to them the importance of what they're doing, what they personally are doing overall to advancing our organizations, it further deepens their relationship and commitment, and obviously making sure that they're always properly supported along the way. Developing leadership among volunteers is very important. So when you ask someone to take a leadership position, be sure you give them leadership. And that is designate the responsibility and require accountability. They do need to be reporting regularly to you or to the structure as has been laid out in that job description. Always recognize personal accomplishments. So in a sense, reward the leadership. Point out that leadership when you see it and let them know. We have to be prepared in working with committees of volunteers to really seek their counsel, really honestly seek it. And sometimes, yes, we do hear cockamamie things, and we all of us have worked with organizations where we have academics or medical staff or artistic staff who are very, very anxious about a board or a volunteer group of major donors who maybe are going to come up with these crazy, crazy ideas, et cetera. It doesn't happen that often. And in fact, if you've structured your job descriptions around what you want them to do, they're providing expertise and perspective on areas that you lack in your organization. They're not going to get that directly involved in you and telling you how to deal with a certain academic problem or a certain artistic problem. they're providing you with perspective and advice on perhaps some of the issues that you have in finance or in physical planning or in specifically in some of the fundraising tasks that you're doing or how you're articulating your work, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's quite important always to have intellectual content and stimulation at all meetings. Sometimes the work that you're asking people to do is fairly not that stimulating sometimes. Like let's say it's in a fundraising setting where we're simply asking them to review lists and give us information about people that they think might be interested or helpful. But it's important for them to have some intellectual content, again, for them to understand in context why reviewing this list of people, which may seem somewhat boring, is so important to advancing the organization. Give them some insider information and access under the tent all the time. After all, they're your special friends. They're your leaders, and it's important for them to have that. And pay attention to peer status. Make sure that your committees are not unevenly distributed so that people aren't intimidated or unable to really share the perspective that you brought them on to share. So paying attention to that is very important in the composition of these groups. Now we'll come to chemistry, and chemistry I think is probably the most important part of all that we're talking about. Having great chemistry with our volunteers and making sure that our volunteers have great chemistry with our organizations creates very, very meaningful partnerships. This is where our organizations truly advance, where you really see these transformative gifts come forth, transformative ideas come forth, where our organizations can really make a difference in advancing their own missions and in making a difference in the quality of life in whatever the area is that we're focused on. So connecting the organization to solid and productive networks of sustainability, meaning that these long-term relationships with volunteers is very important and comes very much out of the chemistry. Staff play a very key role in creating chemistry. It is often one of the biggest staff challenges that we have because, remember, we work with lots of different kinds of volunteers and changing volunteers, changing from one chair to another chair, and you may have very, very difficult, or difficult's the wrong word, very decisively different styles from one chair to another, different energy levels, etc. You have to be in a position to know how to develop chemistry and elicit out of those leaders their biggest gifts that they can contribute. I mean their personal gifts, not just their financial gifts, but the biggest gifts that they can contribute to the organization, and that comes from chemistry. So I think this is one of the most rewarding responsibilities we have. But for staff who are unskilled, or perhaps even more importantly, unconcerned, this is truly a deadly minefield. And I think all of us have seen situations where presidents, CEOs have gotten sideways with the board, and all of a sudden they are vanished. They're gone, and sometimes in rather public firing scenes, etc. So this is a very important part of our work, and it's one that one develops over time and hones one's abilities in. It requires very focused, careful judgment at all times, depending at the level, of course, that you're dealing with, but certainly at the governance level, that's the most risky area. So now let's move to a few tips for staffing volunteers, and these are sort of in some ways, they're summaries of points that we've made earlier. You ultimately are responsible, so you have to take the lead and the initiative. But if you've developed the chemistry and you understand the personalization that's so important with your volunteers, how you take the lead and the initiative is going to be different depending on the situation. So in some cases, taking the lead and the initiative means taking the lead and the initiative behind the scenes. In other cases, it means much more taking the lead and the initiative up front. And it really depends on the relationship and the energy and the style of the particular, say, board chair that you're dealing with, or committee chair, or complexion of volunteers. It's important to respect volunteer expertise, perspective, and commitment. Truly respect it. It's not just window dressing. But remember the meaning of volunteer. And sometimes I think we get into a situation where we get very frustrated that somehow he or she doesn't, can't do this right this minute for us, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they have another life sometime, and we have to know how to work around that other life, but understanding that our life is advancing the organization. The use of these written job descriptions is very, very important, and having formal orientation, as I mentioned earlier, is quite important, I think, too, in terms of staffing volunteers. Ensuring the volunteers understand the mission and case. We've talked about engaging volunteers and focusing their energies on very specific tasks, but having them understand the relationship there. Match the right leadership to the right issues. That goes back very directly to that recruitment process that we talked about, where we have thought through what are the qualities and the skills that we want in this position, and how do we then match that to the right, to the right issues. Make the partnership work for you and your organization by making sure you keep them informed, providing that under the tent access, honestly seeking counsel, and being in a position to truly listen. One size doesn't fit all, as we said. That personalization part is important. Recognition and acknowledgement of personal service is so important, both in public and private settings, and indeed with awards and events. Having a clear sense of the succession plan, particularly in boards and committees, planning at least 1 to 2 years out in advance. Know who your next chair is, or who you're grooming to be next year. Haven't we all been in a position where we have dreaded that so-and-so is going to be the next chair, and how are we going to get through the next 3 years? Because we didn't do proper homework in making sure that we didn't get our organizations backed into that type of a situation. Think about creating volunteer career ladders. Many of you out there have heard me talk about the indicators of a culture of philanthropy, and one of them is, are there volunteer career ladders in the organization, and are people aspiring to them? And obviously, thank, remembering again that they're volunteers, and it's all about relationship building and building that support for our organizations. So what are some of the challenges in volunteer management? There's many of them, but here are 5 of them that seem to be key, and I think are the most prevalent. The first one is maintaining the proper roles of volunteers. Remember that volunteers are there for policies, particularly now we're talking at the board level, and not for management and not for operations. And organizations get into very difficult, dark waters sometimes when those roles get confused. Being clear about what the volunteer is doing and what the professional is doing. Paying close attention to the terms of reference is important, but this takes constant vigilance to make sure that one is paying attention to these proper roles, and that the ship is afloat and going in the right direction. Focusing on the institutional mission is also very, very important. And often, this is a staff responsibility, and it does require a close partnership with your board chair or your committee chair, but you can get into situations where committees or groups of volunteers can be starting to take you off on a track that really is not part of your mission. And it may be an interesting and whatever, but it's not part of your mission and your organization's mission. And we have the responsibility to keep volunteers on track and to focus that. And so that can sometimes be a challenge. But if you've had that developed that really strong chemistry with the chair and with several people, you can have very honest conversations about this and get it back on track. I think for us, a big challenge is that continuous, meaningful engagement. And this really comes from regular communication about the connection of the task to the mission, as we talked about earlier. Having useful meetings, making sure that when one has a meeting, it really is useful, and effective time management. And this means time management for not just the use of the volunteer's time, but the use of your time and staff time. This is very, very important when we look at the staff support side. If staff support is insufficient, it means often that a committee will stray from its terms of reference, the individual volunteers will lose interest, and it almost always means very poor performance. If, however, the staff support is too much, if what you've set up requires, and you've got volunteers that are, gobbling up your time, that becomes a waste of the institution's resources, and is deterring you from the work that you have to do in advancing the institution. And so you have to work on developing and focusing the proper balance that way. So it requires very, very careful judgment all the time. And I think just being mindful of these things is really, really important as one moves forward. So here we go. Now, what do we do when the chemistry goes bad? Then what? Well, indeed, difficult, awkward situations happen. And again, I would say to you that the professional behavior and standards must always prevail. And again, from the very beginning, if you've made it so clear the professionalism and the seriousness, you're already on much better territory when you get into rather awkward situations. Going back to the clarity of the terms of reference is very, very crucial. But I have to say to you that unmet expectations and poor performance cannot be ignored. That is our responsibility because, as I said, we are ultimately responsible in our organizations. And we are not holding our obligation to our employer, in our case the employer, if we allow things to go really that far off track. So again, I'd say here we are in the firing. So here's the teaser, the sexy part, folks. It's analogous again to a personnel problem, but guess what? Not so straightforward because we are dealing with a volunteer. We're often dealing with someone who may be very politically well-positioned either in our organization or more often in the community or in areas of influence, in circles of influence. So this can get very, very difficult territory here. Here are some options. Now, let me be really clear. None of these is perfect. There is no easy solution to all this, folks. There really isn't. Although I would say to you, if you have been thoughtful and developed, again, you've been dealing with those volunteers in a very professional way, you have more capacity to handle these things than you do if that hasn't been your behavior. So the first thing is there's a term of office. We all know that. This is the one we love, right? Well, John will be off, his term is up in another 6 months or another 18 months. We'll just, ride it out and he'll be gone and he's not going to be renewed, okay? That's possible. And I think that's probably the one we most often fall on, let's be honest. Depending on how serious the situation, that can be viable. A reassignment where we realize that this person is doing such damage in an area that it's important to reassign him or her to something else. And yes, folks, that does mean sometimes we create something that we hadn't really thought about, but to go to that person and say, we really need your help, John, on this. Could you do that for us and work on that way? Neutralization is a very popular one, too, one in which you surround that individual on a committee with other people of a different point of view, and pretty soon his or her perspective is just one of one small minority versus a large, a major sort of bullhorn in the forest for us. And then finally, this issue of removal. And there are situations when one does have to remove a volunteer. And I would say those are issues that are ethical and moral issues that sometimes institutions face, and that you have the responsibility to face that square in the eye, folks, and deal with it, even sometimes at your own peril, but you have your own integrity to deal with there. So how do we do, what are some of the ways we do that? Well, a strategic use of colleague volunteers can really make a difference here. If you've developed that good chemistry, and certainly in all the years I worked with organizations, I knew who were the ones that I particularly had a special relationship with, the people that I could take into my confidence and be candid with them, seek advice on appropriate action, and indeed engage them often as the power people in the volunteer structure to take action. And that does often work. But it's, again, that I can't underscore how important that chemistry is. So in summary now, and then we'll go to the questions. I know, as I said, there's been a lot of material we've been over here, but I think in summary, these tend to be what I think we think are the key success factors in dealing with volunteers. And we've talked about every single one of these, I think. Obviously, that issue of being strategic in terms of planning about the role and function of volunteers. The skilled use of the terms of reference. I think now, in the beginning, it might not have been as clear as to why all those written materials were so important, but it becomes clear, as you can see, when you're dealing with very awkward situations in which a volunteer has wandered way off, not only off course, but maybe outside of the expected behavior that he or she must exhibit in your organization. The issue of finding and recruiting always the right volunteer, in the same way we go through very elaborate staff searches, finding the right person and not settling for someone who's less than the right person. Briefing and training that person, professionally supporting the volunteer with frequent and clear communication with the kinds of technical expertise to support his or her work, and with true respect for the volunteer commitment that this person is making. And I think, as I said in the beginning, for me anyway, what has inspired me and kept me going all these many years in this field has been the extraordinary commitment of some of these volunteers to really trying to make a difference. And I think that it's that enormous respect that we have, recognizing that, they could pick up and walk away tomorrow. They're not being paid for this. So many volunteers never expect they're going to get into some of the very difficult situations that they have to, and they face it with grace and with a real strong sense of commitment to making a difference. And that, I think, is, as I say, one of the joys of our work. Thanking and recognizing the volunteer always is very, very important. And then ultimately, turning these volunteers, who are also most often our most significant donors, into true lifelong partners and ultimate gift donors for our organizations. That is really the ultimate goal of this, and where we, I think, can feel a great sense of satisfaction. Now, we'll go, I believe, to questions. I hope I've been okay on time. Yes, I think we're okay. So we have a few minutes of questions. And very difficult, folks, to do these because I can't see your faces, but I know a lot of you out there, so hopefully you've got some questions.
Okay, Royal, we just had one come in. You have drawn the parallel between staff management and volunteer management and the importance of applying some of the same principles. Do you think we should have performance evaluations for volunteers?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And I think that the concept of performance evaluation is very important, and indeed is, I think, embedded in some of the practices that we discussed. Now, do I think that one formally should get into, writing up those wonderful things that we all do? No, I don't think that. But what I do think is that, again, as part of our responsibility for developing the chemistry with volunteers and for understanding what are their passions and how they see their work and service, I think you can get into a proper relationship with these volunteers in which you are able to comment on how their service is going by eliciting how they're feeling about it. Also, as I said, always complimenting them and in a certain sense rewarding them for special service and leadership, but opening up a conversation sometimes about, gee, how did you feel that situation or your performance went in that situation, and opening up a conversation in which the volunteer is able to state him or herself where they thought it could have been better and what they could have done. And often they will turn to us when you develop that relationship with them and say, look at you and say, you know, Royal or Mary, could I have done that better? Or what's your perspective on that? That's my answer.
Okay, and we just had another question come in. What do you think is the most important element to managing and working with student volunteers?
I think with students, perhaps the most important thing is their understanding how critical what it is that they're doing is to advance, and in this case I'm sure it's with a university or a college or an independent school, it could be, but that their concept of that what they're doing is really making a difference. And then I think one has to be very prescribed with students about what you're really looking for them to do. And they always will take, at least in my experience, will take a lot of direction, etc. But their work is more is buoyed or is illuminated, I would say, by their understanding that what they're doing is really making a difference. And I've always thought in working with student volunteers that we're really trying to develop them as the next generation of people, of donors that are going to serve our institutions, so that they begin to grasp the importance of the philanthropic traditions in our institutions and can model those in the future as they grow, you know, into themselves major donors.
Okay. Another question. Would you talk a bit about the appropriateness of our having personal relationships with volunteers? Can they be our friends?
That's a very, very good question, too. I think, well, the first thing is I think you've heard me say that for me, some of the most rewarding parts of my work in a number of institutions over the years has been the work with these volunteers and the relationship that I had with these individuals who inspired me for their commitments. Now, when I say the relationship I had with them, I would say to you there are very, very few volunteers that I would ever call my close personal friends. There would be an occasional situation, but very, very rare. I would call them close professional friends, yes. But I think that what we're doing with volunteers is, remember, our role is to develop their relationship ultimately with our institution. And I think one of the greatest testaments of us as professionals, because few of us spend our entire careers in a single organization or institution, one of the greatest testaments to our ability in developing volunteer relations and donor relations is the fact that when we leave and move to another institution, that those relationships are rooted and continue to grow and blossom in the institution that we were previously. I think that's the greatest testament, and that means that the relationship has been really, we were representative of the institution, not just of ourselves. That being said, I can tell you there are still volunteers from years, 3 decades ago, that I still share holiday cards with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's still people that I'm close to, but I wouldn't call them professional. I wouldn't call them direct personal friends. It can get very difficult and very dicey particularly if you're in a situation where you've got a governance situation and you're employed by the board or whatever. But there are exceptions, and it can happen, and it can happen if both have great maturity and can understand that the sometimes fragile relationship about those roles.
You talked about the importance of approaching volunteer recruitment not in a haphazard way, but rather deliberately planning for it. Are there situations, however, when someone does appear on the scene that seems to offer so much to the organization that you simply feel like you have to find a place for this person even if there's not been planning for it?
Yes, I'd say absolutely yes. I think the point I would try to make is that we want to avoid that situation as much as we can. In my experience, in most institutions, what happens is, we meet Jill and we think she's just great, and we're going to hire her. We're going to put her on this committee or that committee, et cetera. And we find that we may have put a bunch of people on, but without any thought as to what it is they can contribute or how we can make it a satisfying experience for them. So I think that the point is to try to be as strategic and comprehensive in our planning of the operation with our volunteers and not be haphazard. That said, though, absolutely, there are situations, as there are, as we know, even with employees. Look, there are certainly times that we see someone that we know would be available to, would be interested in working with us, and we don't really have a position, but their skills and their background are so extraordinary that we say we need to get this person into this organization because of what he or she can contribute. So I would say absolutely there are those situations where one does indeed need to do that and should do it, but it should become the exception, not the mode of operation, which I tend to think it tends to be right now, kind of this mode of operation.
Okay. Another question just came in. Are there situations where it's important for us as staff to walk away, and how do we know when it's necessary to do so?
Yes, and I think I alluded to some of that about having your own integrity, et cetera. There are situations, and I think we've all seen them, where particularly if you're at the CEO level or working with a board, that if that board is so diametrically, in your mind, even in ethical terms, taking the organization into or adopting practices that are unethical in your mind, and you have done everything you can to try to turn it around and to bring it back, and you can't because of the political situations or whatever, I think there are times that you have but no choice but to resign and walk away. I think they're very rare, honestly. I think sometimes when we hear about these things, they're not at all in terms of ethical or moral situations. They're often in terms of conflicts of personality or egos that have gotten into the way, et cetera. And I think you need to park your ego when you're working with volunteers. As I said, we need to adjust to the different energy levels and style levels of our leadership, and take pride, and that's what this profession can be about in terms of what we're doing with volunteers. So I think in most of the cases when we see this kind of somebody says that they were resigned or whatever, I don't think it is about ethical situations, but I think there are some. And I think that there are times that you absolutely have to. And I mean, there are plenty of situations you can think of, and I can even give one that could have been that way for me, but it was calmed down. I remember being involved years ago in a university trustee who was involved in a sort of sexual harassment of one of our staff, and I had to be very direct about that behavior. Had to stop immediately. And if it hadn't stopped, I can tell you for sure I would have walked because I could not. I mean, that's maybe a little bit extreme, but there are those types of situations. But it's very, very rare, I think. It's much more about how you're managing those volunteers and how you're understanding their energies and their personalities and their own sort of egos and how you work that through.
Okay, and we've got time for one final question, Royal.
Okay.
If you have a volunteer who doesn't take no for an answer and goes from one university leader to the next until they get what they want, how would you suggest handling such a situation?
Well, we do see that. We do definitely see that. I think that there's an example. There are two things one can do, I think. One is that one looks at the various university leaders and has an honest conversation with them and makes them clear as to, sort of alerts them to this type of behavior. And so you can sort of nip it in the bud. But probably the most effective way of dealing with that is the strategy that I suggested, which is that if you're close to say, the chair of that person, or whatever if that individual is on a certain committee, and he or she is not the chair. Now, of course, if it is the chair, you've got another problem. I understand that. But if it's not the chair, then being able to and you have that good chemistry with the chair, being able to take that chair into your confidence and talking with him or her, that chair will take that on and take care of it. I've seen a lot of situations where that's happened, and those are examples of the kinds of things, as I said, that volunteers sometimes never expect they're going to have to get into these types of confrontational things, but they do it with great commitment and great grace because of their belief in the organization's mission and why it's important. So you can handle it that way.
Okay, and I think that concludes today's presentation. Thank you, Royal, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Session materials will be emailed to you tomorrow, and please visit grensglier.com if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.